The Dyrwood Part 1 Early Colonial History. Northern has quite a wild and bloody recent history. From colony to Palatinate to Free Republic, the Dyrwood has undergone a trial by fire to emerge as a powerful force of the Eastern Reach. Dyrwood's history actually begins in Adir in 2602 AI. Adir explorers returned from a journey across the ocean with tales of the treasures they'd found. They discovered countless ruins scattered through the forests, as well as plains to north of the trees that would be perfect for growing Vorlis. There was a problem, however. The locals were hostile, and there was potential for conflict. The Farkonig of Adir knew that this was too good an opportunity to pass up, and sent more explorers to scout and map the area. Exploration continued over the next 20 years. Small groups of explorers traveled back and forth between Adir and this new world, with a handful of colonists setting up small camps to establish a base for the explorers to work out of. Conflicts with the locals, who the Adirans learned are called the Glanfathans, were rare, but frequent enough for the Farkonig to send a small squadron of guards to help protect his citizens. These guards established a central base on a river in the western section of the woods. The settlement would eventually become the city of Dyrwood, upon which the modern-day village of the same name is presently built. Once that base was established, the first permanent Adiran settlements began north and west of the Bale River. Over the next 3 years, thousands of Adirans made the trek from Adir to this new land. The Glanfathans, who seemed to revere the ruins scattered through the forest, caused a few problems with some of the settlements, especially those founded near the ruins themselves. These were easily taken care of by the colonists with the help of the Imperial Guard. The Adirans, in order to further their foothold in the area, reduced the cost of production, and in an attempt to keep the Glanfathan population under control, started making slaves out of any Glanfathans captured during the uprisings. This results in a great increase in tension between the two groups. With the population of the area growing, an official governmental structure is established by the Farkonig. He appoints several earls to preside over the land, and assigns them thanes to help run their territories. They called a new Griefram the Dyrwood. Dyrwood remains the center for the Imperial Guard, but the settlement in Pearlwood Gulf, New Dunreard, is the true seat of power for the area. Sitting at the edge of the ocean, forest, fertile farmland, and a river that runs from the coast to the White March, settlers flocked to the area, hoping to establish names for themselves. Adir began to spread across the new land. The Dyrwood Part 2 The Broken Stone War. In 2626 AI, a group of farmers, while clearing farmland for planting, accidentally knocked down one of the ancient Adra menhirs on their land. This innocent act drew the ire of the native population and started what would come to be known as the Broken Stone War. When it was finally over, several thousand colonists had been killed, as well as hundreds of the Glanfathans. Even though the war was technically over, the Glanfathans escalated their attacks on the settlers over the next 2 years, using vicious tactics that left many colonists, several military figures, an earl, and 6 thanes dead. Unable to stop the Glanfathan attacks, the earls elected Earl Edrang Hudrid to the position of Graf. Well respected, known to be a master of military tactics, he was tasked with dealing with the Glanfathan threat. Edrang fought with the Glanfathans, led by an Orlin named Regd, for the next 2 years. Neither side can gain the upper hand on the other, resulting in a tense stalemate between the two groups. Because of this stalemate, the hostilities slowly died off, and in 2631, the Dyrwoodan people signed a treaty with the Glanfathans. Regd would step down, the Glanfathans would stop their attacks altogether, and the Dyrwoodan people would leave the ruins alone. This treaty angered the nobility in Adir, as it brought to a halt the supply of artifacts. Edrang also tried to get the practice of slavery outlawed, but this was not successful. Because of this, the peace between the Dyrwood and near Glanfath is uneasy and tumultuous. Small patches of rural violence still cropped up, but were easily dealt with, as neither side wanted another war. The Dyrwood Part 3 The War of Black Trees and the Rise of Admeth Hudrid. After the Broken Stone War, the Dyrwood would see peace and prosperity for 21 years. Aside from the occasional slave uprising or border dispute, nothing of any note happened until 2652 AI. Some of the Dyrwooden earls, tired of being restricted by the treaties and encouraged by imperial sources, defied the decrees and actively sent people to loot the ruins in the Dyrwood. Response from the Glenfathans was not immediate, but when it came, it was brutal and bloody. There was a slave uprising, and Raid resumed control of his guerrilla fighters. A contingent of Delimgan joined the forces as well, making the fights in the forest even more deadly for the Dyrwooden soldiers. Edrang, then far too old to lead Dyrwood in the war, sent his son Admeth to deal with the situation. Admeth, showing the same tactical prowess as his father, set fire to the forest at the Iseuar River, and then blocks the forces retreating from the Inferno. Some of the Glenfathans escape, but thousands would die in the blaze. Regd is captured and sent to holding in New Heomar. This goes on for several months, and Admeth uses the same tactic many times to flush Glenfathans and Delimgan from the battlefield. The entire war lasts less than a year. The Dyrwood eventually wins, but at a terrible price. This conflict would come to be known as the War of Black Trees. Tragedy struck the Dyrwood in 2654, when Edrang, whose health had been waning, succumbed and passed into the cycle. Regd, who had developed a begrudging respect for his constant adversary over the years they had fought, sent Admeth his sincere condolences from captivity in New Heomar. Admeth assumed his father's place as Gref over the Dyrwood. The other earls disliked this development and began publicly rebuking Admeth's decrees. In 2655 AI, Admeth, tired of the problems caused by the recalcitrant earls, but having support of the New Valian dukes and the common folk of Dyrwood, having saved them from the Glenfathans, delivers an ultimatum to the Farconig of Adir. He demands to be made a Gref Palatine. This move would give him authority and power over all the earls, their holdings, and their titles. Dyrwood would become a Palatinate instead of a Griefram. The Farconig, who did not want to have to deal with a rebellion while trying to establish a hold on the Vorlous trade network in Ridceres, begrudgingly agreed to Admeth's demands. Admeth would use this new power to bring all the earls in line. As a trade-off for being given the power, Admeth put money and resources into all of the Dyrwood's ports to increase shipping traffic. In turn, this increased the Farconig's income. Under Admeth's rule, the Dyrwood saw 7 productive and profitable years. In 2662 AI, he did what had been tried for many years without success, bringing slavery to an end in the Dyrwood. He negotiated the 10 Years Treaties, so called because it has been 10 years since the War of Black Trees. A timeline was established in which the slaves would be released. The owners would be compensated with money or land for each slave released. If they did not comply, the slaves would be taken, and a fine would be levied against the owner. In return, the Glenfathans would open trade with the Dyrwood and cede some of their territories to the Dyrwooden government, in practice meaning they would stop contesting the presence of those who lived and ruled there. Hundreds of Coopers attempted to rebel against this. Admeth, expecting just such a reaction, reacted accordingly, and the rebellion was quickly crushed. His agents then spread propaganda through the populace, making the Coopers' rebellion and its instigators seem far worse than they truly were. This tactic worked, and there would be no more trouble. The Dyrwood Part 4, Hudrids Rebellion. The rural communities loved Admeth Hudrid, considering him the best leader they'd ever had. In Adir, the Farconig rankled against his usurpations of imperial authority, but no longer had the necessary power to truly undo anything that had happened. 2 years later, in 2664 AI, the Farconig found allies willing to explore the ruins against the treaty conditions and plundered them for their artifacts. This was done discreetly at first, but they eventually became careless. The agents were discovered and arrested, but there was no evidence pointing back to the Farconig. Admeth, suspecting the truth, used Glenfathan Bishogwin, mindhunters, the progenitors of modern-day ciphers, to investigate the matter further. With this method of interrogation, he discovered a chain of evidence all the way back to the Farconig. While he investigated, many rural communities suffered retaliatory attacks by Glenfathans. Armed with this new information, Admeth worked with Galvin Medra, the new leader of the Glenfathans, and the rural communities of the Dyrwood to prevent the Farconig's agents from entering the ruins. There was a back and forth between the two groups, both sides engaging in various political, economic, and military maneuvers to try and gain the upper hand. The Farconig was at a disadvantage in this game, though, as he preferred to assert his authority without causing an uprising. Eventually, Admeth had enough. He convinced 7 of the 9 earls to join him, and they severed their allegiance to the Farconig, declaring themselves independent, and decreed they would govern themselves, just as Rebellion republics did 20 years prior. Admeth told the people he had tired of policies that made the nobles rich while putting the people of the Dyrwood at risk. He declared himself a duke, again, modeled after the Rebellion republic's governing structure, and called the Dyrwood a free Palatinate. Thus began the War of Defiance in 2668 AI. The war lasted 4 years and caused countless casualties, including Admeth himself. The Dyrwoodans, with their Glenfathan allies, were able to persevere. Glenfathan astrologers, alongside the Dyrwoodan forces and members of the ad hoc Knights of the Crucible militia, won the Battle of Defiance Bay, which became the last battle of the war, and left Dyrwood free from Adira imperial rule. 7 of the 9 earls of the Dyrwood survived, and, unified in purpose, signed treaties with the Farconig of Adir. The war gave the Dyrwood a greater sense of unity between its citizens and their Glenfathan allies. Admeth Hudrid was revered by both groups, and the Dyrwood enjoyed for the first time a nationwide fellowship of independence, perseverance, and sacrifice. Yenwood and Srinsrune were dissolved and incorporated into the surrounding earldoms, leaving 7: Hellsgate, the Grasp, Tenfors, Norwich, Coldwater, Ashfall, and Belreach. New Dunreard was renamed Defiance Bay and would become the seat of power for the new Duke in Belreach. The new Duke's rule began in 2672 AI. The Dyrwood Part 5: The Proliferation of Animasi. Animasi, outlawed while under Adir rule, was technically no longer taboo after Hudrids Rebellion. Academics began its study again in earnest in 2681 AI. By 2697 AI, there were almost 40 academics actively researching the field, both in the Dyrwood and the Rebellion republics, even though no significant results have been discovered. A tragic breakthrough of sorts happened in 2704 AI. An animaster, working in Belreach, accidentally shattered the souls of about a dozen volunteers who had been helping him. In retaliation for their deaths, the citizens of the area stormed his house and killed him. The Earl of the region, not wanting to waste resources or anger the locals any more than they already were, did nothing to find the head of the vigilante mob, but neither did he outlaw animacy. To ensure their own safety, most animasters moved from the rural areas where they were studying and settled in Defiance Bay, many of them choosing the emerging and wealthy district of Brackenbury as their new home of operations. While there were still a few breakthroughs and the study of animacy continued for the next 24 years, it quickly slowed as it became cost-prohibitive and complicated the more people learned about it. Most animasters couldn't afford to continue research without the support of donations or gifts from wealthy individuals and organizations. In 2737 AI, some animasters, desperate to continue their studies and seeing no other means of furthering their research, entered the forbidden ruins of Ir-Glanfath to further their research. They discovered some such sites had strange artifacts that seemed to bear affinity to soul essence, and began to prod at the devices for further insight. Even with continued research, they were unable to tell quite what they had discovered. Eventually, they were found out by the Glenfathans, who captured some of them, demanding they be punished for their crimes. The Dyrwoodan authorities, in order to maintain their treaties and keep the peace, had no choice. They allowed the animasters to be executed, according to Glenfathan tradition. This led the Duke to make an additional proclamation. The study and practice of animasi on, or even near, the Glanfathan sites would be punishable by death. In 2780 AI, in order to solidify relations again with the Glanfathans, the Dyrwoodan government allowed some animasters to begin training and experiments in conjunction with the Glanfathan Mindhunters, their native ciphers. This was an exchange of information. The animasters documented the secrets of the Mindhunters' powers. The Mindhunters learned new techniques for concentration, which assisted them in taking their powers to a level no Glanfathan had seen before. The ciphers, no longer wary of the animasters' intentions, trusted them to such a level that they convinced the Glanfathans to give some animasters limited access to some of the training sites where the Glanfathans practiced. The Anamphas of the Glanfathan tribes opened the training grounds to the animasters. They were not allowed inside, as this was still strictly forbidden, but the general allowances by the Glanfathans were seen as a breakthrough in relations between the Dyrwood and their Glanfath. Over the next 8 years, the animasters' research would continue unimpeded. With the exception of some minor squabbles, there has been no major strife between the two groups for almost 120 years since. The Dyrwood Part 6, The Saints' War, and Widewind's Legacy. In 2807 AI, war returned to the Dyrwood. Saint Widewind, transformed supposedly into a living incarnation of Aethys, marched on the Dyrwood from Raidceris, beginning the Saints' War. The Dyrwood rallied at Halgoth Citadel and took the battle to him in Raidceris, attempting to prevent as much damage to their own land as they could. Even though there were devastating losses for the Dyrwoodan forces, using Hudrids military techniques combined with Galvin Reg strategies, they were able to secure a few victories for themselves as well. Raidceran forces made their way into the Dyrwood through White March, unopposed by the locals at Coldmourn, leaving Mercy Vale burned and devastated. The contempt the Dyrwoodans have for Coldmourn for this betrayal lasts well after the war ends. Desperate to end the war and eliminate St. Widewind, the Magronic clergy of Dyrwood developed a special bomb that was hidden beneath the bridge in Halgoth Citadel, intending to lure Widewind to the bridge and then detonate it. Their ploy succeeded, as St. Widewind was completely destroyed, along with most of the forces with him and the entire bridge. The 12 Dyrwoodan men and women who volunteered to delay St. Widewind on the bridge were also lost, their sacrifice and martyrdom celebrated by the Dyrwood in the ensuing years. The bomb would come to be known as the Godhammer, as soon after the battle, the citadel was renamed Godhammer Citadel. St. Widewind's forces were easily routed after his death, and the Dyrwood set about rebuilding from the first major conflict in over a century. In retaliation for St. Widewind's action on Aethys' part, many Aethesian followers were purged from Dyrwoodan communities or driven out via social pressure. Less than a year after the devastation of the Saints' War, tragedy hit again. In 2809 AI, the first Hollowborn was reported in the Dyrwood. Many of these poor creatures died within weeks or months of being born. The outcry from the populace calls for blame or punishment to be leveled against someone, whether it be the gods, the mothers, the government, or the Aethesian followers. Responding to great socio-political pressure to try and help the Hollowborn, animasters developed a process to transplant animal souls into the infants, that they might develop survival instincts and even a basic personality. The process seemed successful, so it was repeated on tens of thousands of Hollowborn, even though many animasters disagreed with the technique, worried about the ethical implications. These protests were largely ignored and discounted. The process was soon named Salvation, and the Hollowborn given souls this way were called the Saved. 5 years after the first Hollowborn, an Orlan girl is saved. She entered puberty. In a matter of mere weeks, she transformed into a ravenous, feral creature, devoid of all conscience. Soon, all of the saved would experience the same fate. Each one, upon reaching puberty, would transform into what the locals called Wicts, uncontrollable children. After researching the problem, animasters discovered an incompatibility between the animal souls and the children's bodies. This fueled the parents' anger, as many of them had to kill their wake children. The animasters responsible were widely denounced, and many of them were dragged from their homes, beaten, and in many cases, killed. Most surviving animasters left the rural areas en masse and headed to Defiance Bay. Others left the area completely, moving to the Valian republics to study in peace.